Again, a warm welcome to each one of you. I'm very, very happy to be sharing this tour of the Buddhist art at the British Museum. This is the first of a series of workshops that I'm hoping to give, just sharing some of the learning that I have had over the course of the last year as I completed my master's degree in this topic out in London. And so I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. As I said earlier, you want to be able to get up close to your screen so you'll be able to see. I will make an effort to make things a little bit bigger as we go along so that we can see them. But don't hesitate to let me know if it's a little bit difficult to see. I'll try to make it legible. All right. Can everybody see the slides? There's a slide that says virtual tour of the British Museum. Yes, thumbs up. Okay, great. So, yes, this is a tour of Buddhist art specifically, and the British Museum is a fine, very large institution, as you can see from the images there, in London, England. They hold about 8 million objects. There are so many that they're not really sure, and we could talk more about why that is also later, if that's of interest. But it's what's called an encyclopedic museum, meaning that it is a museum that attempts to cover all the art of humanity since the beginning of time until contemporary times and all over the globe. The objects that are in the museum were, in some cases, stolen, in some cases looted by the British during the times when they were colonizers of various countries around the world, in some cases gifted to the museum by private collectors or by governments, other governments, and in some cases purchased. Yep, so this is a view of the inside of the British Museum there on the left. You can see again, it's a very large space. This number of people that you see there, that's a very tiny amount. This must have been like literally the first 5 minutes of the day because they had 5.8 million visitors in 2023. And I would guess about the same number in 2024, at least the times that I was there. And it is free of charge to visit the museum. And back here you can see perhaps, let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. You can see perhaps how crowded the space gets. So these are the people here in the background in the hallway of the South Asian wing. And it's a very, very busy place. Whoop, sorry. So we're going to go more or less in chronological order. Let me see if Claudia has arrived. Has the other Claudia arrived yet? Not yet. Okay. So we're going to go more or less in chronological order. And that means that in terms of Buddhism, we'll be starting in South Asia. So this is a third-party image of the South Asian wing of the museum. It's sort of toward the back and at the mezzanine level. And my hope today is really not to, just to be clear, is not to give you a sort of walking around tour of the museum, but rather to highlight specific objects and to give you a bit of a chronology in terms of geography. And we have about 2.5 hours. We'll probably take about a 5 or 10 minute break in the middle. And again, in the meantime, if anything comes up, please feel free to put something in the chat or just to say something, stop me and I will help. But So this is the South Asian wing, again, without people. This must have been a photo taken after hours or before hours because it never looks like this. And the South Asian wing is home to objects from various countries, India, Nepal, Tibet, even though Tibet is considered part of China today, Sri Lanka, which is an island off the coast of the southern tip of the Indian Peninsula, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I'll say more about why those two countries in just a moment. But also to say that the British Museum doesn't house all of their Buddhist objects together in one place. So the Buddhist objects are scattered around by country, by the time frame. Occasionally there's a special exhibit that looks at certain Buddhist objects, but generally speaking, as it says here, you will find the Buddhist objects along with various objects from other traditions, spiritual traditions and secular traditions. So we have Buddhist objects next to Hindu objects. So this figure here in the center, the very first object that you see when you come into the South Asian wing is a Hindu object. It is an image of Shiva, the Shiva Nataraja, and Jain objects and other folks. So again, just to say, what do we mean by the South Asian wing? So this is a map. You don't need to see all the detail here, but just to say this is India, this very large, pointy, triangular thing here. And Nepal here in the Himalayan mountains, right at the northeastern or north central border with India. And as I said here on the slide, current political boundaries are not very relevant to us in the study of Buddhist art particularly, unless we're talking about contemporary art, because in ancient times, these were not the political divisions. And as you can see here, for example, China has absorbed Tibet, so Tibet isn't even shown on this map at all. Whereas historically, Tibet was a source of many forms of Buddhist art. But so we have Sri Lanka off the tip here, southern tip, as I said before, Bhutan and Bangladesh to the east, Pakistan and Afghanistan to the west, northwest, and China directly north of Nepal and Tibet. And art historians typically use the topographical boundaries, so the physical boundaries of places, or the ancient political boundaries, so the boundaries of the rulers at the time that a particular object was made. So here, the first object we're going to look at are called the Amaravati marbles. Amaravati, and it's a collection of 120 objects, mostly all made of stone, from the Amaravati stupa, which is dated between, it was a site that was active for about 1,000 years, if not a bit more, from the 1st century before the Common Era through the 13th century of the Common Era. And so this is a diagram of what it would have looked like, what we think it looked like in the past. It does not look like this anymore. And a map of where Amaravati is. So Amaravati is in what's known, an area known as the Deccan area of central and southern India. And a stupa is a dome-shaped site or a dome-shaped object, if you will, that is usually thought to house the relics of a spiritually accomplished person, originally the Buddha. So in Digha Nikaya 16, or Long Discourse number 16, the Buddha is asked by Venerable Ananda, his attendant, what to do with his remains. And he says at first, don't do anything special, but then Ananda sort of presses him and he says, you should do this. You should make a stupa and make offerings to it. And relics are, there are all different types of relics. And one of the main types of relics are these small sort of like pearl-like or gem-like stones that are left after a spiritually advanced person is cremated. Some relics would be things like his bowl that he used, or his tooth, or various other kinds of relics, reminders of the physical presence of a spiritually accomplished person. So I'm just going to show you this very brief video, and do let me know if you have trouble seeing the video. This is a video that I made in the Amaravati area of the British Museum. So you see that they made this special room, and they have all of these stones. This is just a small fraction of the stone stele, they're called. Stele is the name of these kind of carved panels in stone. And they're actually not marbles. They're called marbles as a way of valuing them. And actually the Indian government has referred to them in that way. But actually they're made of limestone. They're made of limestone. And the British made a video about how they conserve them. The Amaravati marbles have been the subject of some fair amount of concern or friction between the Indian government and the British government. And they're very, very special. When I was there at the museum, I had the opportunity to run into some folks who were from Amaravati, actually, and I asked them what they thought about having the stones there at the British Museum. And they said, actually, that they were glad that lots of people would be able to see them there, because folks would not see them at Amaravati proper. But there are other Amaravati stones, Amaravati marbles, in the museums there locally within India as well. So the key thing that I want to talk about that you notice about these stones, though, is that the earliest Buddhist art did not depict the Buddha in a human form. The earliest forms of Buddhist art are typically called the aniconic period, or you could say the non-iconic period, meaning that the presence of the Buddha is indicated only by symbols that represent him, but not in the form of a person with a body. So for example, you have the footprints here. So both of these two artifacts are from the Amaravati stupa. This is called the Buddha Pada. Buddha Pada, the footprints of the Buddha, is a very, very common motif that you see throughout Asia, actually, as a symbol of the Buddha's presence. And so this would, again, be a way of, considered a way back then of actually depicting the Buddha. And here we have another example of the Buddha. This is called the Great Departure. So this is when the Buddha was leaving his parents' palace, Suddhodana and Mahapajapati's palace there. And he was going to set out on his spiritual life. And you see that, and he left on horse, and Chandika was his attendant, his charioteer and attendant with regard to the horse. But you see that we don't see him on the horse. We see only the parasol that Chandika held above him, and this object that belonged to him, this being, this horse that belonged to him. So the Buddha's presence is implied here, but it's not actually depicted. And this has been a subject of a tremendous amount of debate among art historians, why it is that for many centuries the Buddha was not depicted in bodily form. There aren't, as far as we can tell, nobody's ever found any kind of rules that would restrict artists from depicting the Buddha, or that would prohibit them from doing that in any way. My personal idea about it is something related to the Buddha's transcendence. So, there's this Lavi Sutta in which there is a person who's dying, and the Buddha asks him if he has any regrets. And the person says, well, no, my practice has gone quite well, and I'm quite confident that, I have attained various kinds of insight, various stages of awakening. But I do have a regret that I never saw the Buddha up until now in person. And the Buddha says, when you see the Dharma, you see me. And when you see me, you see the Dharma. You don't actually need to see my body. He says, what need is there to see this dirty old thing, this dirty old flesh? So I think also that there was a sense that when the Buddha had died and gone on to Mahaparinibbana, that it would be disrespectful to show him as a physical body. That's my belief about why it was done that way. But there are other theories about it. There are theories like that these depictions actually are showing a place and a time of remembering him, and that he's not intended to be actually worshipped with regard to these things. It's just a way of pointing to the fact that he existed at some point in the past, and various other theories that have arisen there. And then I'm going to just expand out a little bit to even broader regional contexts. So here again, we have this area here, this green area is the upper part of the Indian subcontinent. This is India. But there were times when part of India was under the governance of the Kushana, what are known the Kushan Empire, or the Kushana people. And they also ruled this area that in ancient times was called Gandhara. And Gandhara is a very, very important place for Buddhist art. It may, in fact, have been the site of the production of the first statues of depicting the body, the Buddha as a body, as a human body, in around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. So many years after, right, at least 4 centuries after the Buddha's life. There's also some possibility that those first statues were made in this city, Mathura, in India. Again, a subject of much debate among our historians, which place was first, or did they both come up with the idea in roughly the same period of time? And a matter that has yet to be actually sort of ironed out, if you will. But I think we'd suggest that it's not that important to us which one came first, but rather that we want to look at these images of the Buddha and understand what is it that they are trying to depict. So before I go on to talk about that, let me just again have a look here. Okay. And so not all Buddhist art objects are images of the historical Buddha or a Buddha. There are many, many other images that we see in what's called the pantheon, the scope, the full scope of spiritual beings that are described in Buddhism. So you have, first of all, the yaksha and yakshi, that's the Sanskrit name for them, or the yakka and yakini, that's the Pali name for them. And these are like tree spirits and natural spirits, sort of like lesser deities that were understood to be abiding in various parts of the natural world. Some of them beneficial protectors, some of them sort of tricksters, some of them quite angry and harmful. We have lay practitioners who are depicted, royalty, nuns and monks who are not Buddhas necessarily. We have the transcendental bodhisattvas. I'll say a little bit more about them in a minute. and other kinds of deities. So these three images that you see here, these are some of the first actual Buddhist images that you would see as you are walking down that hallway of the South Asian wing in the British Museum. So starting on the left here, left to right, we have Maitreya, Shakyamuni, and Hariti. And all three of these pieces are from that area of Gandhara, that area which is now mostly governed by Afghanistan, Pakistan, and from about the 2nd to the 3rd century of the Common Era. And they're made of this kind of stone called schist. That's one of the emblematic aspects, one of the ways that you're most likely to identify a piece as having come from the Gandharan region is because it's made of this kind of schist. And schist is this gray color. It also comes in other slightly lighter, more beige colors, but predominantly gray. So let me just talk a little bit about these three images. And this is important because here's where we can start to see some of the practice, you could say, ideals that are being upheld. So we saw a little bit of that when we had the symbolism about the Buddha's life. But it's more specific now that we have actual beings with bodies here to relate to. So this is Maitreya, and Maitreya is the Buddha of the future. He is understood to be the Buddha who will come in the following eon. So after this eon that we are living in has completed, which would be an unfathomable number of trillions of years, then Maitreya Buddha will arise and become the next Buddha in the next eon. And I want to make this a little bit larger so you can see. So how do we know that this is a Maitreya Buddha? So Maitreya is sometimes referred to as a bodhisattva. That would be more appropriate, actually. But sometimes he's also referred to as a Buddha because he's going to become a Buddha. And so what we have here in this piece is we have a number of markers. These are called iconography, the iconography of Buddhist images. So we have this person who is shown here with what would be in that time very elaborate robes with a lot of jewelry, very large, very heavy, noticeable jewelry on his chest, on his arms. He has also some jewelry in his hair, and he has this very long hair. You can see the curly hair here coming down. And so these are all markers of a layperson, not a Buddha, right? A Buddha would have renounced jewelry and elaborate robes and things like that. And yet he also has this beautiful nimbus, is what we call this, or the halo, you might call it, behind him. This indicator of his spiritual accomplishment, the fact that he is going to, in the future, be a Buddha. And yeah. And these, the jewelry was sometimes marked with more, you could say, worldly things. So there are Maitreya Buddhas, Maitreya Bodhisattvas that have images of kings, for example, or Greek gods here as a way of, you could say, authenticating their rule, the royalty sort of authenticating their rule. But Gandharan Buddhism really had a great fascination with Maitreya. In fact, there were more images, more statues of Maitreya in Gandhara than the Buddha himself. And it's quite interesting because, you know, Gandhara at that time was part of what was developing into what we later call the Silk Road, right? So this massive trade route that goes all the way from Europe and Persia all the way around through India, up through Central Asia, and across to China. So in both directions, in all the various directions. So the Silk Road is actually many roads, and it was named that much later. It was named that in the 1800s. But Gandhara would have been kind of like the wild, wild west. It would have been a place where there were a lot of people coming and going, a tremendous amount of mercantile activity, a tremendous amount of exchange of ideas, and people, monks and nuns, also traveling along with folks who were from that region. And so perhaps one way to think about this is that Maitreya represented hope for the future. That if even in this life we were subject to all of the economic and spiritual and political pressures of the day, that at some point in the future there would be a wonderful time awaiting us in another lifetime. And in fact, in the Chakravarti Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, so the long discourse number 26, that's where Maitreya is mentioned. It's actually probably something that was added into the Pali Suttas at a later time, not in the original verbal versions. But what we see there is that Maitreya is associated with a time when human beings flourish, when the crops are good, when there's very little disease, when people get along. And so again, he represents, in many ways, he represents hope. And then we see this, this image of the Buddha. So again, we're looking at those same three images that we looked at earlier on that one screen. And this is a very early Buddha, 2nd to 3rd century. May have been some a little earlier than this. Even so, this is fairly early. And what is the iconography, or what are the things that we see here on the Buddha? So let me make this a little bit larger again so we can see what is this. What does this Buddha look like? So what do we have? We have an urna. This is this small mark here between the eyebrows in the middle of the forehead. And it's said in the Pali Suttas that the Buddha could emanate a light from that spot on his forehead. We see that he has this protrusion on his head. It's called an ushnisha. There are various theories about whether the ushnisha represents hair, which it kind of looks like, it looks a little bit like that here, or whether the ushnisha is actually a sort of bump on the Buddha's head, which is his wisdom, that is, as he developed the wisdom of enlightenment, that it created this shape on his head that's very unique. That I would say is probably more, that's closer to what the suttas would have described, that the Buddha was like that. Although the suttas also describe at various points that that certain people would see the Buddha and not recognize how special he was or who he was. So it could not have been anything too extreme. But nonetheless, we have the Ushnisha and the Urna, and those are two very key markers of a Buddha. We also have here his ears, these elongated earlobes. So the elongated earlobes are a sign of the Buddha's beginnings in this life. So he was Siddhartha Gautama. He was part of the ruling clan of the Shakya region. Gautama was his family name, his clan within the larger clan of Shakyas. And this, sometimes people would say that these elongated ears kind of represent the renunciation, and that's true to some extent, but it also, in my view, very much represents the Buddha's independence from the ruling clans. He left the ruling clan in order to be independent as a spiritual seeker and to go on with a totally different kind of life. And that's part of the meaning behind these elongated ears that we see on him. He would have had a nimbus. This little bit here is the only part that's left. The nimbus, or the larger halo behind him, has broken off. Most likely it was part of when he was removed from whatever place he was in. Also, we see that he has very, very simple, more simple robes, just two robes that are visible to us here. So this longer top one, and then this shorter bottom one, as compared to the Maitreya that we saw, which obviously had several, more like 3 or 4 different robes. And he's barefoot. So he was, that is related in the suttas, that the Buddha, after his awakening, walked all over northern India barefoot in his efforts to teach and to collect alms. But this way of having the robes over the 2 shoulders is quite interesting. The knee is bent, the feet are apart, and the robe is over 2 shoulders. And what that means, in fact, it's still done to this day, to have the robe over the 2 shoulders is how we wear it, how monastics wear their robes when they are out traveling, particularly Theravada monastics. When you're in the monastery, you would often wear it only over one shoulder, and you have one shoulder bared. But when it's over both like that, it means that you're out and about. And so this is important also, again, in the Gandharan region, a place where lots and lots of travelers would be seeing this object. And so they could relate to the Buddha as a fellow spiritual traveler, so to speak. In fact, some of those travelers were going through Gandhara as pilgrims on their way to sites in India, and to go see the historical Buddha's places where he lived. So no jewelry on a Buddha, the simple robes, the Ushanisha, the urna. And the other thing that I want to point out here is that this style of Gandharan depiction, maybe it looks to you very Greek. I don't know, for some of you, you may have noticed that. There is very much a Greek influence or a Greek characteristic that was imparted there. It's quite interesting because Gandhara was at one point ruled by Persians, at one point ruled by Alexander the Great, actually, and the Romans, and or the Greeks rather, and Greco-Romans, all of them. And then at one point also they were, they became more independent. So this style, though, again, this way of depicting the style of the face and of the robes. At one point, art historians used to talk about this kind of art as the easternmost art of Greece. And nowadays, we've become much more sensitized to that. That's actually a form of, again, a kind of colonial view of the world, or a view that all real art or all important art began in the West, in Greek and European culture. But actually, that's really not the case. These folks had their own styles of art, and they incorporated various kinds of influences that were part of their own culture. They had a very, very diverse culture. And so their art also expresses that diversity of their culture, and it should not be appropriated by folks as being European or Greek in some way. And finally, the last thing that I want to show you here is on the pedestal. So let's see if I can make this a bit bigger. So here on the pedestal that the Buddha is standing on, you can see some of the lay people. So as I mentioned earlier, lay people are often depicted in Buddhist art. here they are depicted paying homage to this person, or maybe this here, this leaf, we can't tell if that's an offering or if it just happens to be close to that person. But this person here is seated. And again, what do you see? You see if I can get a little closer even, this long hair and this jewelry. So this person seated here, that's Maitreya. So the Buddha will be you could say, the inspiration for the future Maitreya. And so he is depicted here in the pedestal of the Buddha. And again, you also see this kind of columns that became very popular. They have both Indian and Greek characteristics to them, these columns that are depicted on the pedestal. But this is important also aspect of the art of Buddhism, which is the aspect of making offerings, making merit by recognizing or hearing a teaching, being around various spiritually accomplished teachers. And then the third piece, this last piece, also from the Gandharan region, also from about that same time, also in this lovely gray stone called schist. This is Hariti. Hariti. And I bring her up here because I think she's a very good example of a kind of being that is most likely a local legend that becomes part of Buddhist legendary stories. So she is an ogress, and she likes to steal people's children. And so, as the legend goes, the Buddha approaches her and says, and takes one of her children and hides that child under his robes. And she gets very, very distraught and upset looking for the child that is missing. And the Buddha says to her, you see that is how other people feel when you are taking their children. That's how they feel, and you shouldn't be doing that anymore. So eventually, she has a very hard time receiving that teaching, apparently, but then eventually, apparently, she does stop. But the way that we know that it's Hariti is, again, that she has these small children, much, much smaller than her. So she's being depicted as a being that's much larger than life, much larger than human size, right? Because these children are so tiny. Even the tiny child that she has in her lap is relatively small compared to her. And she has this jewelry and this elaborate hair that is, again, indicative not of a monk or a nun or a Buddha or an awakened person, but of a being that is still living some other sort of life with some adornments. So she also has even adornments on her ankles, right? So very, very common at that time. And I find this piece was something that a friend of mine actually presented when we went to the British Museum for our class. And the way that her breasts are depicted is so awkward. You know, you think, oh, this person didn't have a lot of experience depicting women because she looks very, very awkward this way. But this is, again, this is very common. So we see on both sides of the field, right? So we see the Hinduism and Jain stories that are incorporating various local legends about Buddhists. And we see, conversely, Buddhists that also take on local legends of other traditions or even just beliefs from the local areas. So that's Hariti. And so that's the three from Gandhara. One thing, let me just go back for 1 second, which is to talk a little bit about the bodhisattvas. So as I was saying, Maitreya is the future Buddha, but what that does is it makes him a bodhisattva. So what is a bodhisattva? Bodhisattva is a being, if it means literally bodhi is awakening and sattva is a being. So it's an awakening being And the Buddha himself, historical Buddha, is said to have referred to himself as the Bodhisattva before his enlightenment. He was an awakening being before his actual enlightenment. And so later on, this becomes a very important aspect of the teaching in what are known as the Mahayana traditions. So the Bodhisattva as a being that aspires to awaken and that also aspires to support all other beings to awaken and eventually attain Buddhahood. And so then what happens though is that the bodhisattvas, there are these what we call transcendental bodhisattvas. So there are bodhisattvas that actually go beyond their personal search and acquire certain greater powers. So we'll see some of the transcendental bodhisattvas later on. But that is basically all of the art from the Buddhist, those three Buddhist pieces that I wanted to share. Let me see how my time is doing. Okay, we're okay here. So now these are objects, again, these are a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to go briefly through these. And this is just to show you that oftentimes what the museums will do, and the British Museum being no exception, is that for Buddhist art, they have certain pieces that tell the story of the Buddha's life, the historical Buddha's life, as it is told, more or less reflecting how it was told in the Pali Suttas or in the Chinese agamas, Ekotarika agamas. So this piece, for example, what we see here is a woman lying down, and we see an elephant kind of leaning down toward her. And this is Queen Maya. This is the Buddha's mother. And she's conceiving him. She's having a dream of a white elephant that enters her side. That's the story as it's told. And these would be her attendants there in the palace. And so the Buddha's conception is one of the very significant moments of his life that's often told. Here we have a moment. This one's very, very hard to see. I apologize. These are photos that I took myself when I was at the museum. This is supposed to be an image of the Buddha's birth. So this is Queen Maya again. Sometimes she's known as Mahamaya. And the Buddha was said to have emerged from her side. So here he is, and here is somebody catching him with a cloth. And so the Buddha's birth is another of these precious moments. And, you know, we see the ways in which there's an effort to tell this story of the Buddha as clean, as untouched by various aspects of human life, such as being conceived in a womb through sex or being born through a woman's womb. It's a very interesting part of his story that his mother, Queen Maya, Mahamaya, dies 7 days after his birth. And because the story is told this way, I sometimes wonder actually whether it wasn't a cesarean section, whether there wasn't either intentionally or because of some distress that was happening, because the story is that she was on her way to her mother's, which is quite common, that the mothers would be present for the births, but she didn't make it there. And that's why she gives birth to him in the Lumbini garden. And so I wonder whether it wasn't actually, what we would call a cesarean section now, and they didn't really have the medical know-how to do such a thing, and she died shortly thereafter. That's one way to understand, perhaps, what happened in a more practical way than the actual legend of it, which again is an effort to imply that the Buddha was clean in some way, free from bloodiness and those kinds of things. This is the Buddha in the palace. He is here seen kind of turning away the riches of his father. The entertainers who had been attending on him are asleep. There's a story that he tells in the suttas where he was kind of grossed out. He was kind of disgusted at some of them sleeping and, slobbering and snoring and so on. But this is intended to depict a moment when the Buddha is preparing to make the decision to leave the palace. And then again, this is the great departure, which we spoke about earlier, right? And so now here, though, we see an actual person on the horse, right? So this is a few centuries after, a couple of centuries after the Amaravati marbles. And so this is here, this is the Buddha on his horse leaving the palace. And so we see that he still has his hair at that time, and he still has his kingly robes. It's said that he went out on the horse and with Chandaka, and then once he was beyond his the palace area, then he trades his robes in for the robes of a beggar or a person. And yeah. And this is also part of the legend. So again, we see the legend told in many different ways. This part of the legend here is that there were devas, there were lesser deities who actually held up the hooves of his horse so that they wouldn't hear, the guards of the palace wouldn't hear him leaving. So these are some of the key moments there that are often depicted in the Buddha's life: conception, birth, and departure from the palace. And then we have a little further along the path, the austerities. Yeah. So again, we need to think about these depictions as what are the kinds of practices that are being either held up as ideals or that are telling a story about the way of awakening of, in this case, the Buddha himself. So we have this very, very difficult portrayal of him here, right? With where he's gaunt, his cheeks are hollowed out, the veins on his forehead are showing, and his mouth is turned downward. And this is the time when the Buddha was fasting, right? So the Buddha tells of a time when he fasted to extremes. He fasted to the point almost of death before he eventually gives up that kind of effort at control, and he finds some self-compassion and also some realization that joy is a key aspect of the path, and he cannot have, he says to himself, he cannot actually experience joy in a body that is so worn down. So he takes food from Sujata. That's sometimes also a moment that's depicted. It's not here, but that's also a moment that's depicted. What we have here, this is a very interesting piece, this little stela here. This is a very small piece, but it is showing essentially two moments at the same time, or potentially two moments at the same time. So here we have the Buddha. Let me see if I make it a slightly bigger. Here we have the Buddha, and you can see that he already has his Ushnisha, so his wisdom has arisen, and he is touching the earth. This is called Bhumi Parsha Mudra. So what is a mudra? A mudra is a symbolic hand gesture, and this is a hand gesture that relates to the moment when Mara challenges the Buddha. So Mara being the sort of dark side, or the trickster who is trying to prevent him from waking up, asks him, "Why do you think you are worthy of waking up?" And in response, the Buddha touches the earth. And there have been many, many interpretations of that. I think for me, it's clear that the Buddha is basically saying that just to be of the earth, just to be an embodied being, is worthy enough, is a demonstration of the principles of awakening that he's awakening to. So he touches the earth. And so that is a moment where he overcomes, he is said to have conquered any difficulty with Mara, with the dark side of himself, perhaps, or with the dark forces externally, depending on how you want to interpret that. But the other thing that we see here, so we see the Bodhi tree. These are the leaves of the Bodhi tree. You might recognize them. They have this little heart shape that is true to life. And the Bodhi tree, I forget which generation we're on, maybe 6th generation, is there at Bodh Gaya. So Bodh Gaya is a site just outside of the city of Gaya in northeastern India, in a region called Bihar, now called Bihar. And the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and woke up. But we also have this. We also have a whole host of people here. Some other folks dress like monastics here. You see that they're wearing the same kinds of robes that he has. And some folks with hair and other types of adornment. So other lay folks or perhaps deities up here. And we also see this small thing here. This is the wheel of Dharma, the Dhammacakka. So after his awakening, the Buddha is said to have turned the wheel of Dharma by teaching what he had understood to the 5 ascetics who had previously practiced with him. So could be these 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Huh? But so this would be called in art historians' terms, particularly by Dhammadipa, a woman scholar, very respected woman scholar named Dhammadipa, Dr. Dhammadipa, and she has called this a kind of synoptic view, meaning that there are 2 moments being depicted in the same frame with one main actor who is showing us both. The moment of his awakening, the moment of his overcoming of Mara, which is not his awakening, let me be clear about that. The moment of his overcoming of Mara and the moment of his teaching it later on to the 5 ascetics. So both things are happening on the same single view. Well, sorry, I keep doing that. Then another moment that is often depicted is the Mahaparinibbana. So that is the moment of the Buddha's death. He is passing away from this lifetime, and because he has completed his work, he has completely left this realm with no attachments, then he goes to Mahaparinibbana and he will never be reborn again. That is how it is described by him and by others in the suttas. And this moment is very, very commonly depicted. He said that he was lying down on his right side. His most recent disciple is here sitting and doing what you would do, which is to apply the teachings and wake up. Here we have other folks who are quite upset. They have their hands up in the air, or they're having some upset, some sadness about the Buddha's death. And here we have a naked Jain ascetic, perhaps, who is also present at the time of the Buddha's death. In Kushinagar, that's the city in which it is said to have happened. And one thing that I also want to point out here is a little bit hard to see at the bottom of the screen here. So the stupas, as I said, are described in that same sutta that describes the Buddha's death. After his death, there is a moment of what to do with his relics. And the way that the story goes is that the Brahmin Dona divides up, in order to keep people from fighting over the Buddha's relics, the Brahmin Dona divides it up into 8. And so at first, there are only 8 stupas in the world, or 8 sets of relics. And Amaravati was said to be one of them. So those are the lifetime of the Buddha in short version. Yeah, so again, the Buddha's life story, sort of telling the highlights. And these stelae would have been at stupa sites. So there are many, many hundreds of stupas across all of Asia. And they would have also been in monasteries, for example, places where monastics were. And so folks would learn the stories of Buddhism by seeing this art at various places and having the monastics explain to them what it was, what it meant. And so that they would feel their connection to those original stories and to the monastic lineages that came down from him later. So this is the last piece I want to stop on before we take a bit of a break. And actually, maybe I'll stop for some questions too, and then we'll take a little bit of a break. But this is the last piece I want to stop on, and it's to me, this is a really beautiful, very, very interesting piece. It actually was the first art history presentation I ever made there in the British Museum, was about this little bronze. It is a standing Buddha identified as Shakyamuni Buddha. So when we see a Buddha, we should know that it might not be Shakyamuni. It could be one of the Buddhas prior to Shakyamuni. So for example, Vipassi Buddha or Dipankara Buddha. Dipankara Buddha is very often depicted. But it could be Shakyamuni, the Buddha of our era. And this one has been identified as Shakyamuni. It was probably discovered in Tibet. That's how the British Museum describes this piece. And the reason they say that is because there's some blue in the hair. So let's get a little closer. I don't think we can actually see the blue. But that was a practice that was very, very common, that art pieces would travel across various parts of the Asian world. And in Tibet, there was a practice of putting blue in the hair of the Buddha, of the many Buddhas, actually, as the Tibetans understood it. But this piece is actually very, very likely to have been made in Bihar, in the northeastern region of India, where Bodh Gaya and Nalanda University are very famous pilgrimage sites. And so here again, we see the robes over both shoulders, indicating that traveling out of the monastery. And we see that he's holding the corner of the robe in the hand as a way of sort of emphasizing this mode of travel, I believe. And also we see that his foot is lifted. He's actually got one little foot here. Let's see if we can get very, very close. He's actually got one foot higher than the other. And I'm not sure what the British Museum has made of this. They actually made a little stand for this piece where you can't see that this foot is lifted. Maybe they thought it was a flaw, but in my view, it's actually part of the whole scheme here of the Buddha in this traveling mode of the robes. And also he has his hand in what's called abhaya mudra. So abhaya means fearlessness. Yeah, so this is the Buddha would encounter people and he would give them a sense of ease, a sense of the fact that he was coming from a place of peace and non-harming by this gesture. So, and again, we see the Ushnisha at the top, we see these elongated ears, various markers of the Buddha. And this is from the 7th century. It means it was the early medieval period. In fact, this piece sparked the theme that is behind my thesis. It's not one of the objects from my thesis for the degree, but it is related to them, we believe. And that's part of that is because it has this very unique casting, internal casting system here, which they made in order to make the pieces lighter for pilgrims. So it's the Buddha traveling as a pilgrim in a form that is only 14 inches tall and that weighs roughly, about 10 pounds or so, maybe less actually. So that is an object that was intended to be given or sold to pilgrims who would take it to places like Tibet and Gandhara and China. And the artisans came up with these very novel ways of working with it. But this is a very pivotal moment because prior to this, as I said earlier, people would have only seen a depiction of the body of the Buddha at places like a monastery or a stupa or some kind of holy site, or maybe perhaps in the palace of some king who had commissioned a piece if they felt an affinity to it. But the fact that individuals could now own a statue, an image of the Buddha was a huge shift. It was a very, very important shift. So that now we today can also do the same thing because of these very creative artisans of the 7th century in northern India. So I'll stop here and just allow, let's say maybe about 10 or 15 minutes for any kind of questions or reflections. I know it's a lot of material, and as I said, you'll all get the slides later. If you give me your email address, we'll get you access to the slides so that you can go back over it. But we have a bit of time for any questions. Yes, Jessica.
In the slide you had before, and you mentioned that there was a Jain who was also, I guess, mourning the Buddha reclined. How is it that you know he's a Jain?
Because let's go back and have a look there. Because he's naked. So the Buddhist monks and nuns we wear robes, and the Jains were what they call sky clad. They were, for the most part of their asceticism was that they didn't wear clothes. So let's look more closely at this person here. So you can see the penis, and you can see that there was no covering whatsoever on this person's body, as compared, for example, to this person next to them. Can you see all that, Jessica?
Yes, I see that.
Okay. Okay.
Guy
Great.
behind him, then, to his upper left, does he have clothes or no clothes, or
This one.
yeah?
Yeah, it looks to me, I mean, it's hard to see from here, but it looks to me like there's a little ridge here. So that person would be wearing a dhoti. So, Indian men at that time might have been bare-chested. You see he has some jewelry here, and he has a turban on. And maybe here at the waist, this little bump that we're seeing here would have been his dhoti, his lower cloth. But because he is wearing jewelry and a turban, he's definitely not a Jain.
Okay, and the
Or
guy,
I would say he's definitely not a Jain seeker. He could have been a Jain devotee, a lay supporter of the Jains. We don't know. But there were present, at least as it's described in Long Discourse number 16, Digha Nikaya 16, there were Brahmins, there were Jains, there were lay folks of all sorts who were present at the death of the Buddha, in addition to the Buddhist monks and nuns.
and are the ones that are in robes to the right of the Jain, would that have been one of his disciples or monks or something, or is that
Yes.
a lay?
most likely, I would say this would be one of the other Buddhist monastics.
And that's no jewelry, plain, simple.
Exactly. And the carrying of the one robe over the shoulder like this and held in the hand, held in the left hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. And these are exactly the kinds of questions. It's very good that you notice these things and ask about these things, Jessica, because these are exactly the kinds of questions that art historians ask when we look at a piece, right? We look at a piece and we say, okay, what's the symbolism that's being used here? What is it that we see on this person? What is it, what's their context? What are the other people doing? And we use that to sort of sort out what the image is meant to mean, because we don't have those old interpreters, verbal interpreters anymore.
So was Jainism, did it develop at the same time as Buddhism, or did it predate Buddha?
Well, definitely it predated the Buddha. There were Jains prior to the Buddha. The Jains were, or Jains, if we're pronouncing it correctly, I believe that's a little bit better pronunciation. They were, yes, a very predominant group of seekers in Indian history. Mahavira, in particular, was a contemporary of the Buddha. And he's mentioned many times, actually, in the suttas, and many different Jain teachers and lay devotees have various encounters with the Buddha also.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, Becky.
Yeah, I was interested in the method of casting that you referred to with the last image that you showed us. You mentioned it, but you didn't give us the detail.
Yes.
Good.
Super fascinating. I'm happy to share the detail. And actually, I will do a whole workshop, ideally, at some point in the future on my thesis, because as I said, that piece is related to 4 objects on which I did my thesis. But let's go back to this piece here because we have a nice little view here. So this is using the method called lost wax casting. And the way that it's done is that the artisans would make a clay image, slightly smaller than the final one that they want the statue to be. And then they would coat the clay with wax. And they would carve all of the beautiful details, like the details of the hair and the little lines on the robes, and all of those beautiful details would be carved into the wax that was on top of the clay. And then they would put another layer of clay on top of that. And then you melt it, you put it in the furnace, not the hottest furnace, but a medium furnace, so that the wax melts out. And then the space where the wax was is where you pour the metal in. You pour the copper or the bronze in. So bronze is a compilation, is a mix of copper together with tin. In this case, they were generally slightly higher tin, again, because they were trying to make them lightweight and easy to work with, faster to create, to make. But the interesting part, so all of that's wonderful, and lost wax casting was a method that had its origins actually in the ancient Indus civilization several thousand years before this. And it actually traveled throughout all of the world. But interestingly, this particular set of pieces have another layer of something interesting, something unique, which is these small dots that you see on the X-ray. So this here is an X-ray of this object that was taken and shared by the conservators at the Metropolitan Museum who were doing a study of this type of casting method. And what you see, these dots here represent channels, so that again, in order to make the thing lighter and make it actually much more efficient to produce, they, at the very beginning, while they were making the clay, they would have these channels inserted in them. So again, it's a demonstration of the agency, the exercise of agency and creativity of these artisans, that they developed a whole system by which they could make objects that would be portable to sell to pilgrims. So it's a very, very interesting phenomena, and it's one that is partly interesting because for a very long time, I would say even up until today, many art historians and Buddhist historians viewed the artisans as being like slaves of other people. They actually, because they didn't sign their pieces, we know very little about them, and they're treated as like the tools of production, when in fact, we can see evidence, especially in these particular very unique pieces, we can see evidence of their authority to create very novel systems of technology and novel objects, visually. Yeah, yeah. We could go on. We could really go. I could really go on that one, and we will actually. Hopefully, if we get a chance to look at my thesis, I'll do a special little workshop about that one, because I really had a very, very fun time actually also learning about this lost wax casting process, and we can see some videos and things like that. But okay, I think unless there are any really burning questions right at this moment, I think we should take about a 10-minute break, okay? So we'll come back at 7:25 or 6:25 for folks in Mexico, and we'll pick up with Sri Lanka and the rest of Southeast Asia, China and Southeast Asia, and have a look at some other pieces, okay? Great. See you in a few minutes.
Audio there.
No, turn it off.
Oh, wait.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the second half of the virtual tour of the British Museum's Buddhist art collection. So I'll go ahead and bring up the presentation again. Okay. Yeah, so moving on from India, then we get a look at this piece from Sri Lanka. And this is a really beautiful piece. She's quite tall. She's about, I would say, full size, perhaps even slightly taller than life size. And this is an image of Tara. Tara is a Vajrayana deity, primarily from the Vajrayana deity, who's said to have emerged as the tear of Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion. And we'll see her again in a few moments. But she's one of those transcendental bodhisattvas that I mentioned. So the idea of a being, her name, or actually Avalokiteshvara takes on all the various genders and all sorts of different forms, said to be one who hears the cries of the suffering world and responds with great compassion, active compassion. And so this is Tara. This is one of her tears, one of her minions, so to speak. She is also bronze, so an alloy of copper and tin. And sometimes other things would get mixed in quite frequently. A little bit of silver, a little bit of gold, a little bit of lead or iron. Other things would be mixed in sometimes. This particular one is gilded. And this statue stands at the very back of the hallway. So right before you enter the Amaravati room, at the very end of the South Asian wing hallway, this statue of Tara is on a tall pedestal so that she's quite high above you. And this statue is very interesting. This image has a very, very interesting history. So she came to the museum a long time ago. And she was considered to be too explicit. And so she was put into a room called the secretum. And the secretum was a room where only very, very special people could have a look at the pieces of art that were there. And in a very interesting turn of events, the Tara is now on the homepage of the museum's collection page, described as one of the highlights of the British Museum's overall collection. So she is considered to be a very, very special piece. And that is because to produce a piece in bronze of this size is a tour de force. It is an incredible accomplishment. It requires a tremendous amount of skill on the part of the artisans. And as you can see here also, there are some signs of corrosion, indicating that at one point in her history, she was buried. So this was also a very, very common practice in many parts of Asia, especially in India, and apparently in Sri Lanka, where there would be times of unrest, there would be times of bandits, there would be times of actual government, political or other kinds of oppression of Buddhism or resistance to Buddhism. And so people would bury very important pieces of art for safekeeping. And then, they would be found, they would be part of an archaeological find or an accidental find when other work was being done at the site. So the Tara is from the 8th century in Sri Lanka. And, again, that practice of metal casting and skill with that traveled from India across many different parts of Asia. So also Indonesia and Sri Lanka have been very strongly influenced by the Indian artisans in bronze. And then again, we have this beautiful tanka. So again, the Vajrayana is really not my strength, but this is a very, very unique piece that the museum has. And it's so tanka maybe is a word that y'all are familiar with. That is the name of this kind of a painting. It says that it's both paper and silk, and that's normal. But the question is the painting itself on paper or on silk? Because oftentimes they would be layered. So it could be that it is a painting on silk with the paper layers underneath, and then this silk border that has been attached all the way around. Or it could be that it is a paper painting with further paper underneath and silk layers underneath for stability. And then they hang. So this is a view of the back of the piece. And so this is the Mahasiddha Saraha. And Saraha was an Indian ascetic who was considered to be a founder of the Vajrayana traditions, who brought esoteric forms of Buddhism into Tibet. And is this particular Mahasiddha. So Mahasiddha means a great yogi, a great, you could say somebody with spiritual powers, the Siddhas, is particularly closely associated with the Mahamudra school. So let's get a little closer. That's the main image here, this person. And yeah, you see this very distinctly Tibetan style of painting, right? This very unique way of painting the nimbus around here, and the skulls and the hair, and this very, very incredibly detailed work here, these lotuses, all of this very stylistically we would recognize as Tibetan style today. At that time, it was just developing, and in fact, most likely quite strongly influenced, mutually influenced the Chinese and the Tibetans in the styles of painting around this time. And there are various other characters here. And then we have the background. So again, it's on a silk, it's on a scroll, a hanging scroll. One of the main issues that folks have with regard to tankas is whether or not to display them, because in order to hang them, then they're, exerting, they're subject to the forces of gravity. And you can see here very clearly that this one has had quite a bit of deterioration of its stability of its fabric. The museum mentions on the website that they have done some stabilization of this piece, which often is very, very detailed work done by a conservator, where they would take apart, to some extent, take apart the layers and reapply some glue or some other way of attaching them, sometimes stitching, sometimes glue, and try to help them last a bit longer. Interestingly, it has on the back this very, very, so somebody took a photo of the back, thankfully, because many times the tankas also have some very interesting imagery on the back. And you can see here that this is a depiction of a stupa, yeah? And you have somebody's handprints here, unknown whether this is the artist's handprints or some teachers or some person from the monastery who blessed this piece. We're not really sure. There's also some writing here. Very, very often on the backs of the tankas is written a verse that is a quote, said to be a quote of Venerable Sariputta. So Venerable Sariputta was one of the Buddha's two closest disciples, along with Mahamoggallana. And Sariputta was asked to, in brief, to share what was the Buddha's teaching in brief. And he says, Ye dham hetu pabhava te sang hetu tathagata aha te samcho te samchayo nirodho evam vadi mahasamano, means that which is of the nature to cease, the Buddha has declared its cessation and also its arising, and these are the words, the teaching of the Buddha. That's a rough translation of that phrase. There's a phrase that appears quite often on various pieces. And I bring that up because I think that, from my perspective, it is a pointer at the intention of clearly understanding that no matter how beautiful a piece of art or valuable or precious or devotional a piece of art might be, that we understand that it's not going to be around forever, that it too has its cessation. And I would say that's particularly important if you believe that some part of this person's karma is embedded in this object, whether it's the karma of the artisan or the karma of the person, the being, the deities or beings that are depicted. Also, just a note that you have these small objects here, these very colorful little objects. These are ways that conservators use to measure light damage. So they compare over time photographs of the pieces and compare these sort of standardized colors to the colors on the piece, and they can tell whether or not it's deteriorating over time. So this is one of the ways that they do that, is by using these kind of standardized things. And you also have, I think, just a plain old ruler here also, which is something that might be helping to, again, determine any distortions in the fabric or in the painting itself. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that piece. So then we move on to the Chinese wing. So on the floor, so when we walked into this floor of the British Museum, the South Asian wing is on the left-hand side, that long hallway that we looked at earlier. On the right-hand side, you have an identical long hallway going in the other direction, and that is China. So the Chinese wing, again, is one of the largest wings of the Asian collection, one of the largest pieces, aspects of the Asian collection. And but much of it is secular in nature. So I've pulled out a couple of key pieces here to highlight for us to have a look at Buddhist art specifically, but know that there is quite a bit, actually, of Chinese art in the British Museum, in part because the British explorers, archaeologists and explorers were in China along the same time as the French and the Germans, and they were part of various archaeology digs, and bought at pennies, really pennies, or again simply took home souvenirs, many objects from China. And during the Cultural Revolution, at the time of the so-called Cultural Revolution in China, there were laws enacted to prevent that kind of thing from happening. But that was much later. In any event, this is a beautiful piece. This piece, people such as myself and many other people often stop and stand in front of this piece. This is a life-size seated image of an arhat, a Chinese arhat. They're called the luohan. And the Chinese really revere the luohans. There are very many types of depictions of them in paintings and statues and all sorts of ways. And this particular piece is quite dramatic. It's quite impressive because it's actual ceramic So let me get a little closer here, and you can see that it is stoneware or ceramic ware, glazed. So it's basically like a giant piece of pottery, if you will. And there's some cracks here because it's a very old piece. And it has this beautiful, beautiful glazes on it, depicting the robe. And this very, very impressive face of this practitioner. And yes, a kind of seriousness and yet ease in him. It's a very, very beautiful piece, and remarkable that it survives, actually, a stoneware piece that is that old. Whoop. This is from Hebei province. So Hebei was a real hotbed, you could say, of artistic activity. Whoop. And this is from Liao dynasty. So usually Chinese art is categorized by the dynasty because during different periods of political periods, as I said earlier, this one way for art historians to relate to regions of the world was by regions that were being ruled by a particular group of people, but also because the sort of tastes and culture and society would shift with the different types of rulers. And so we see also corresponding shifts in the art of various periods. So this piece is somewhere in Liao Dynasty 900 to 1125 of the Common Era, from one of the cave sites. And so there, if you might have noticed that there will be a presentation on the Western, 3 of the Western cave sites. That's a workshop that I'm offering in the new year. So this is the Chinese Luohan. And then we have this other piece of art. And this is a wall painting. And it brings up the question of what is immovable art and why is immovable art in some place other than where it was created? So this is really, again, one of the key questions that swirls around much, if not all, of the British Museum collection. This is a wall painting that was extracted from the Qingliang dynasty, from the Qingliang monastery, which was a very popular place, Mount Wutai. So Mount Wutai is a very, very important pilgrimage place for Buddhists. It said that Manjushri, the transcendent bodhisattva of wisdom, resides on Mount Wutai, and so it was a place of many, many pilgrimages. And this monastery was one of the way-seeking places, one of the stopping places for those pilgrims. And it was a very beautiful, beautiful piece. So we have 3 of the transcendental bodhisattvas depicted here. So in the center, this is Avalokiteshvara, who we saw earlier, or we spoke about earlier. She, he, they, it represents the face that we put on the quality of compassion. It represents active compassion in response to suffering, awareness of suffering and response in a skillful, compassionate, wholesome way. And to her left is Samantabhadra. So, and I should say, so she's better known as Guan Yin. So Avalokiteshvara is the Sanskrit name, and Guan Yin is the Chinese, Guan Shiyin or Guan Yin is the Chinese name given to her. And Samantabhadra is the bodhisattva of great activity. So something like, yes, in other cases, what kind of response in other cases? And then we have the Bodhisattva Manjushri. So as I said, Manjushri was believed to reside on Mount Wutai. He, usually a he, is the face that we put on the quality of wisdom. on the quality of wisdom in Mahayana Buddhism and later Buddhism. And Manjushri is also, the image of Manjushri is usually the image that is housed in the meditation hall in traditional Japanese Zen Buddhist locations. Rather than having the Buddha, we have the embodiment of wisdom as an inspiration to us, finding our own wisdom on the cushion. So you can see numerous things here on this piece, and I just want to spend a little bit more time on it. One is, it's kind of hard to see their faces, and the pigments are pretty dull. They have degraded over time. What you also see is, I don't know if you can make this out, but what you also see is that you have basically these square pieces of plaster that have been then placed on another plaster so that they could be mounted on the wall. And then the conservators at the British Museum have painted in the gaps so that from a distance it appears to be a larger piece than what you have. What you actually have are these pieces of plaster. See, there's a very large gap here, for example. You have these pieces of plaster that have been torn off the wall, and as a result, they are very cracked. They are very rough around the edges. They don't actually, there are parts missing. They don't actually capture the entire image because it was literally being scraped off the wall. It was never intended to do that. The method of making these things is probably very similar to the cave painting style that became very prevalent in China. And we actually had an opportunity to make some replicas of this by hand, myself and the folks in my cohort. So the first thing to do would be to find an appropriate piece of wall, stone, or a plaster wall that was already there. But then they would make another layer of plaster out of clay, sand, and some hay or some hair to kind of stabilize it. And you mix all this up by hand with some water and apply it to the wall, smooth it out as best you can, and let it set. Then once that's done, so this is a secco style of making wall paintings, as distinct from what we see in many, many parts of Europe, which is the so-called fresco style, where the plaster would be laid up on the wall and painted while it was wet. That's the fresco style. But in China, for the most part, it's secco style. So you place the plaster on the wall, you allow it to dry. Typically the next day it would be dry, or maybe a couple of days if it's a very thick layer of plaster, in order to smooth the area. And oftentimes the plaster also cracks when it's drying, so you have to make some adjustments there. But then they would apply a white background, and you can sort of see a bit of that here, like in these lower areas where some of the white has the upper coat of white has either flaked off or has faded, and you can see underneath the base coating of white, usually made with alum powder. Alum powder was the white that was used as the background. And then they would grind up pigments from minerals or plants. So they would grind up different, like lapis lazuli and quartzes and all sorts of different types of minerals. And I can't think of a plant right off the top of my head, but there are also pigments made from plants and from animals, actually, sometimes insects and things like that. And they would mix the ground up pigments, the ground up minerals or plants, together with glue that's made from animal skin. So they would take the skin of the deer or the ox or the rabbits, and it would produce this kind of sticky substance, and then they would mix this together and use that for the paint. Again, somewhat different than what we see in much of Europe, where Tempera is the form that's used. It means using egg or egg whites as the sort of adhesive for keeping the pigment together. In any event, again, this is a beautiful piece. This is at the very end, at the very back wall of the China wing of the British Museum. This is a later piece, 15th century, so later, relatively speaking, than the ones we've seen so far. And again, so Buddhism emerged from India and went up through Gandhara, up through Nepal and Tibet into China very early, very, very early, maybe 3rd century or so. But it took quite a while for Buddhism to actually take root in China, and it also evolved over time in various ways. And so this is from the Ming Dynasty. And you can see basically the scale of the painting here. That's why this person is here, is just to give you a sense of the scale of the wall painting. Okay, and speaking of grand scale, so this is a gift, and this is the Buddha Amitabha Buddha. Amitabha Buddha presides over the Western Paradise, the so-called Pure Land Paradise. There are entire sects or schools or traditions of Buddhism that are very devoted to Amitabha, also known as Amida Buddha. There's a lot of chanting tradition around him. This piece was a gift from the Chinese government in the late 30s. As you can see, this is the reason why I'm mentioning it here, even though it's quite a bit earlier than the last piece that we looked at, is because this is the stairwell. So right here to this, in this opening here, this is where we would have walked in and found the South Asian wing on our left and the Chinese wing on our right. But here in the stairwell, which leads up to the Japanese and the Korean collection, we have this enormous standing Buddha, 19 feet tall. It is made of marble, this beautiful white marble that again is very emblematic, is very, very commonly found in Hebei province in China. And interesting, now this is the kind of situation that you would only find in a place like the British Museum. So the British Museum received this piece in 1938. They found a place for it. They've had it displayed here in the hallway. Back in 2020, they had some time on their hands and they did a cleaning of the piece and they discovered, oh, lo and behold, it has an inscription on it. And the inscription tells the date and the temple at which this piece was originally installed. So it's a very old piece from 6th century, Sui Dynasty, and it's from this Chongguan temple. And they did a little video. Again, this is a video with no narration, but it's kind of interesting little video of the cleaning that took place when they discovered this inscription, which is way down here on the pedestal of the piece. So it's very hard to see the way that they have it displayed now because they didn't know actually that it was particularly important to be able to see the pedestal. But there's a very, very beautiful, impressive piece. And what you see here is a very beautiful depiction and a very kind of stylized depiction of the robes of Amida Buddha. And there are still traditions in China that wear robes very, very similar to this. Very, very similar, with this belt and this other belt hanging down and this piece of, it's not a piece of jewelry, but there's like a metal loop here. And you see here on this piece, as we have seen with many of the pieces, that the hands are missing. That very commonly happens because, as you can see, the main part of the piece was carved all in one, and then the hands are a separate item. And there are these wooden dowels in the holes there, and so there would have been a wooden dowel in a hole that was in the wrist of the hand, and that's how they kept it together. And of course, the wood was the weakest part, and so oftentimes the hands would get lost. And you also notice, and I failed to mention this earlier, but we've also seen the lotuses. So very, very common in Buddhist art is that precious beings, awakened beings, precious beings, whether they be actual historical beings or deities or bodhisattvas of various sorts, stand on lotus pedestals. And this is another very, very good way, very interesting way of dating a piece or finding comparisons to a piece when we want to find out, when we want to try to identify where something might be from or what period of time it might be from. We sometimes look at the lotus pedestal and try to find one with a similar style, because this would have been something that, again, that was changing stylistically quite frequently. Okay, so that's the last of the Chinese pieces. Then we go to the Korean wing. And so, again, because much of the collection in the British Museum was a result of their colonialism, they have less of a collection from Korea, places like Korea and Japan, where they were not the colonial rulers. They have smaller collections for these other countries. So the Korean wing is, as I said, upstairs from the other two Asian wings. And this is an iron Buddha. It's actually not one that belongs to the British Museum. This belongs to the National Museum, Korea, and it was loaned to the British Museum, to the British Museum for the purpose of this display that they were doing here. And that's very common. The museums, especially the larger ones, they tend to loan their pieces to each other. It's very, very common. But this piece is a fairly old one. And iron, again, is a very, I would say, fairly common in certain parts of the world. So India, for example, has great iron ore naturally occurring. And so they also had many iron pieces, but for whatever reason, it did not become very popular with the Buddhists. The Buddhists prefer the copper. But here in Korea, apparently, the iron Buddha was very revered, this particular one. And he is, again, in this Bhumi Parsha mudra, right? The touching the earth mudra, the moment of overcoming all obstacles to awakening, all sort of doubts and difficulties with Mara. And you notice here, however, distinct from the other Buddhas that we saw, that he has his robe only over one shoulder, right? So this would be the way of wearing the robe when one is practicing by oneself or practicing inside the monastery, and not when we're traveling, when we're out traveling to teach or out traveling for collecting our meals. And just generally, I want to say as an overview that what we see, and what we've seen again here, is metal and ceramic objects, and of course, stone, right? So metal, stone, ceramic objects would tend to be found, would tend to last over centuries. And they would be found through archaeological finds, through digs that are being done for other reasons, like building, construction, and so on. But wood and paper items are very, very commonly lost, right? Because they're much more fragile. They deteriorate more quickly. And unless they are in a very dry condition, they also deteriorate from humidity. So I just wanted to put here the 10 agents of deterioration. So the program that I was in was not only art history, but also conservation of art. And so we learned a little bit as well about how to preserve against, or how to work in response to or in prevention of these 10 agents of deterioration. So fire is a very common way to lose objects, right? It's through fires, especially in monasteries, I would say is a very common thing that has happened periodically in the past. Light damage, so we talked about that with respect to the tanka, but certainly any kind of painting. And many of these statues would have been painted in the past. Pests, also a big problem for textiles, but also for objects made of wood. Physical forces is things like earthquakes, very, very prevalent earthquake region in Western China, in Japan, for example. So we see those kinds of problems. Or physical forces, also things like if you need to move an object in the museum or take it down off the wall from wherever it's being displayed, right? Those physical forces was part of the reason why that triptych of the three bodhisattvas was damaged. Humidity, so and water of various kinds. So humidity meaning water in the air, and water of floods or being dropped in some way into water, or if you're fighting a fire also. Temperature, so very important for various kinds of metals. They can tolerate a wide range of temperature, but if they are painted, then that can have an effect on the paint. But also the temperature of other types of objects also is very important. Like again, with paper, for example, high temperatures, high dry temperatures might be good for paper for some period of time to help them last, but not indefinitely. Pollutants, definitely a big problem, both pollutants in the air and the water. Disassociation means when important information about an object becomes lost. And this happens all the time, whether it's because of a transfer of ownership or, again, theft or people trying to hide the original source of a thing. There are many ways in which, or, the database breaks down. There are many, many ways in which key information about both the past, the way that the thing was originally made, but also any kind of care that's happened to it since then, is when that's lost, when that key information is lost, that also can lead to more rapid deterioration of the object. Theft and vandalism, of course. Very, very big problem, actually, at many, many cultural heritage sites, vandalism. All right, we're getting to the end here. So Japanese wing. So the Japanese wing is upstairs, even a bit further upstairs from the Korean. And the Japanese wing is beautiful. It's, again, a mix of secular items and Buddhist items and Shinto and all kinds of other things. This particular item, though, is very, very, very interesting. It brings up the question of originals. What is it that makes something valuable? Is it valuable only because it's old, or is it valuable because it looks old, or is it valuable because of its aesthetic? So this is a replica of the Kudara canon. So again, canon is another name for Avalokiteshvara or Guan Yin, right? The Bodhisattva of compassion. And this canon is absolutely stunningly beautiful. It's a replica of a 7th century from Horyuji. And what happened was that there was an official from the British Museum who was touring with a sculptor, and he saw the original one of these at Horyuji Temple. And he requested that a replica be made, and the sculptor agreed. And he intentionally made the objects, and let me get a little closer even if I can, made the object look old, made it look as old as the original object was at that time when he was making the replica. So all of this work is gesso. It's like a plaster type thing that he has put on here to make this piece look older than it actually is. And it's a very, very beautiful piece. It's the first piece that you actually see when you walk into the Japanese wing of the British Museum. And it's very classical lines, Japanese style of art, and also classical in the sense that this flask that the Bodhisattva holds is very, very commonly associated with Avalokiteshvara or Kannon, or they are also known as Kanzeon in Japanese. And a beautiful thing happened here. So this is made Ichiboku Zukuri. Ichiboku Zukuri is the name of the method that the sculptor used. And it's a very, very old traditional Japanese form of sculpture using almost only one single block of wood hollowed out at the back to make the sculpture. Camphor wood, specifically, so camphor trees are native to Japan, and painted with the gesso and the bronze ornaments added on. And so he used a very, very traditional method. And before that, though, there was a ceremony held to ask the forgiveness of the tree on Christmas Day, 1930, before the tree was going to be felled in order to use it to make this replica of the Kannon. And that is very traditional Buddhism in some way. So this is this way of relating to trees goes all the way back to Indian Buddhism in various forms, yeah, and it takes on different shades of meaning, really. But I thought it was lovely to that they asked the forgiveness, the pardon of the tree before taking it down to create this lovely replica of the Kannon, the Kudara Kannon from Nara. And Nara is a city, very, very ancient Buddhist city, just outside of Kyoto. Just outside of Kyoto. So that brings us to the end of the virtual tour of the British Museum's Buddhist art collection. And again, we have a bit of time for any comments or questions that you might have. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, Susan.
I noticed in the stoneware, the very first lifelike sculpture of the Chinese man sitting, he had his right hand in his left hand in his right hand.
Mm-hmm.
And how, we were explained that the Buddha always had his right hand in his left hand. The left hand held the right hand, but that was the reverse.
Yeah, it's interesting because different schools have different ideas about which way it should be done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's true that in the Theravada we usually say one way, and in the Zen school or the Japanese Zen or the Chinese Chan schools, they often say the other way. And I have to say, as having practiced in both of the schools, I have to tell you that it really doesn't matter, Susan.
It doesn't matter. Okay.
It absolutely doesn't matter. It makes a difference whether you have your hands in the mudra, in some sort of this mudra, or if you have them like flat on your lap, for example, or if you have them sort of just flopped somewhere, or on your chest. It matters where you put them, but whether the right hand is on top or the left hand is on top, it truly, in my opinion, is absolutely relevant.
Okay. Thank you.
But it's good that it's very interesting that you notice that, right? So because the school would have said that it should go one way or the other. Most of the schools will tell you it should go one way or it should go the other way.
You're into the room.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
The Sri Lankan statue, of the very joyfully feminine woman.
Yes, Tara. Yes.
Wide, ample hips for baby making and breasts for plenty of milk. Nonetheless, a very supple figure. But the hairstyle, was that her hair? Is that a?
Oh,
It was like a cone, really high at top of her head, like.
Yeah. Well, let's have another look there. I believe that she has a crown. In addition to the hair there, she has a crown. Yeah. So she does have this very, very high hairstyle, and she has this little pointy crown in the front. And there's a space here, you know, a triangular space here. So I say that, I mentioned that because sometimes, oftentimes actually, with the Kuan Yins, one of the ways that you can tell an Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva of compassion, is that she has Amitabha Buddha seated in her crown. That's a very easy way, actually, to tell the Avalokiteshvaras from the other bodhisattvas. Here, we don't see that image in there, but there's a conspicuously shaped hole there. So maybe there was one that was stolen at some point or something like that. But she definitely has the high hair. And I would say the high hair, going all the way back to Indian times, but certainly Sri Lanka, you know, and India had a lot of cultural exchange there, is a sign of like royalty or a sign of, you know, higher honor.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the other question I have is when I was in Thailand, okay, before going to college, my family took a big Asia trip. Okay, we saw the golden Buddha and the reclining Buddha in Bangkok, you know, and they told us that the golden Buddha, there's going to be an attack by you know, foreigners. I didn't know exactly who, and they were afraid that the golden Buddha would be stolen and melted down, the gold, solid gold. So they covered it in clay and just stuck it in a corner somewhere. And it was completely overlooked for many, many, many years.
Yes.
Until a workman or somebody just accidentally chunked it and they discovered the gold underneath. It was a really funny story.
Yes.
So yeah, you know.
Yes. Yes, exactly. This story has been repeated so many times. Many, many of these objects are buried. And then people forget where it's like squirrels, you know, then you forget where you buried the Buddha and you can't find him. And so he just is there, or, you know, the Tara, she's just there waiting for somebody to find her again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Go back to silence. Yeah.
Yes, Jessica.
While on the topic of these different Buddhas, the Amitabha, how is it that you know he's Amitabha? Is it by process of elimination? Because he doesn't have the jewels of Maitreya and he doesn't have the signs of Guan Yin, you know, the lotus or whatever. I mean, I was just curious, you know, he looks like a Lohan. I mean, he looks like.
Yeah, so it's a good question also. I think in the case of the Amitabha Buddha, so let's see if we look at the frontal picture of him. Yeah. So he has this very, very prominent urna at the front here. And he has this very prominent Ushnisha at the top there. So those two things would give us a clue that he's a Buddha and not a human.
But why
Sometimes.
Amitabha and not Shakyamuni or?
Well, that's the key question. That is the key question, why it is. And I would say it's the artisan would have had to tell us, because there's no other way for us to really know why this particular one is more Amitabha than some other Buddha. So, in fact, that's something also that happens, right? That we don't know necessarily which Buddha is being depicted unless for some reason it's written somewhere, or that information gets carried with it, or it has to do with this temple, perhaps. This is a Pure Land temple.
Oh, it is.
I'm just saying, perhaps, I don't know. I don't know whether Chongqing is a Pure Land temple or not, but if that was the case, and this was the primary, right, this is the primary object of devotion, then we would very likely say, oh, it's very likely to be Amitabha.
Okay.
Because of the tradition, because of its
It's
the tradition.
a question that came to me because you know, my family has different Buddhists, and I always assumed some of these seated ones were Shakyamuni. And then someone said, no, that's Amitabha. And I was like, oh, it's, and then another one, I mean, it was interesting when you said the Maitreya one with all the jewels and stuff, but, and Guan Yin I always can recognize, but sometimes the Amitabha and the Shakyamuni, I'm like, oh, they look the same.
Definitely. And the Dipankara also. So Dipankara Buddha was the Buddha who gave the prophecy to Gautama Buddha in a previous lifetime, or at least that's how the story has been told, the legend's been told. And so Dipankara Buddha looks exactly like Shakyamuni Buddha also. Very, very hard to tell the difference. Unless, again, you get the context. So I'm going to be doing also maybe a session on this Buddha at the Smithsonian Museum. So there's a Smithsonian session happening, I think, in February, workshop. And we'll have a look at one of the objects there that has various kinds of scenes, like these scenes that we saw in the stele. And there's a scene where there's a man and he's kneeling down and his hair is on the ground. And this other Buddha is about to step on his hair. And that is the story of Dipankara Buddha stepping on the hair of this being that he later gives the prophecy to, who later, many, many, many lifetimes later, becomes our Shakyamuni Buddha. So you only know because you have that historical context of that story. Otherwise, you wouldn't have no idea why that one is Dipankara. It's very, very common that we have to kind of sort all that stuff out. But also with Buddhas, so this way of thinking about the Buddha as this figures who don't have jewelry and don't have crowns and have very simple robes, that is all the early school. And then when you get to Tibet, and then later on also contemporary Nepal, like Nepal, say maybe after 12th century or 13th century, like around that time or afterwards, you start to see what are supposed to be depictions of Shakyamuni Buddha with a crown and with a very, very fancy robe, right? And the same thing in China. You see sometimes a Shakyamuni that will have this incredibly ornate robe. And they just decided that he needed to be more fancy, you know? So the artistic creativity.
Yeah, my mother used to tell me, I don't know if this is folktale or Buddhist, with Chinese, it's all mixed up. But, the Avalokiteshvara, when coming to China, turns female into Guan Yin. And she used to always say, of course, she would be female. It is, who else could be so compassionate? They made a mistake in India. She must be female.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, one way to think about that is that, so Avalokiteshvara perhaps was first mentioned in the Lotus Sutra. And there's a whole chapter on her, right? And on them, and it's not really identified that way. But you see, all of the powers that they have and all of the ways, the different transformations. They could be an animal, they could show up as medicine, they could show, right? And so, well, of course, it could be a he, it could be a she, it could be a they, it could be anything, It doesn't, it's not restricted to the gender.
In Chinese, the pronoun is the same, he, she.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
This is such a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope it's interesting and helpful. I mean, I think the thing to do with these objects oftentimes is just if there's one that strikes you, to really spend some time looking at the image, spend some time thinking about where it came from. And again, sort of what was the devotion that somebody put into it? What's the practice that's being described there, right? Is it like in the case of Guan Yin, it's the practice of compassion and responsiveness and care and kindness and gentleness, softness, you know. But take these objects on as a way of thinking about how they are telling us something or trying to tell us something about practice.
Yeah, no question, but just thank you for sharing all of this. It's fascinating and compelling, and I'm finding a lot of threads that tied into the book. I think I told you I'm reading by Taigen Dan Layton about bodhisattva archetypes, and so many of the images and the teaching or the information that you shared connects with a lot of what's in his book as well. So thank you. It's just wonderful.
Wonderful. That's great. Yes. Yes. All right, friends. Well, I think I will, we'll just go ahead and dedicate the merit then. So, may our practice today of seeing and knowing this, these wonderful expressions of the people of the past, and bring us these images of the path and its practitioners, its teachers, its Buddhas. May our practice of tonight, of today, help all beings to know and see wisdom and absolute peace in their hearts and minds. May we all awaken to the Buddha way by the power of the Buddhas, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and each one's efforts. May all beings be free. Bye, friends.
Bye. See you all next.
Thank you so much. Wow, I'm in awe.
Muchas gracias. Sí, muchas gracias.